Going from Zelda, to Neopets, to SMT, to Mario Kart, and now Celeste. You can call me a lot of things, but unvaried is not something I can accept. Now in this video, there are two things that I want to cover. The first thing I had planned to talk about was Celeste, but I think before that I want to talk about indie games as a whole. So let's not stretch this out any longer and just get into it. I'm not the biggest player of indie games, I'll say that right now. Not that I have something against them or anything, it just happens that most of the games that I do play or have played are not indie. But I am somebody who will try a game if the art style is appealing to me, save a handful of genres. With indie games, you're more likely to see different art styles than you would with large-scale AAA games, at least these days. Large companies aren't always willing to take risks with their games having a wild art style that goes against the grain. But a lot of indie games are willing to take that risk because they have to stand out against the AAA companies and their established IPs, and the high quantity of other indie games that release each week. I'll give examples of some indie games I've tried just because I like the way they look. One is a game I've put maybe 2 hours into, and that is Cult of the Lamb. I've always been a fan of the occult theme, and it's something I personally don't see mixed with cartoons very often. I definitely need to go back to that game at some point. Another one would be Hollow Knight. Hollow Knight is one of those rarities where the art style brought me in, but after playing it and finding out that the genre was something I was already into, it kept me. An insectoid swordsman fighting against other insectoids in a dark, usually lonely world makes sense in more ways than one to compare it to something like Souls, both in gameplay and in tone, where you are in a lonely, dark world occasionally encountering others that help you. And those are just two examples. But the third one I wanted to talk about is Celeste, the original topic for this video. Celeste is another example of a game that brought me in because of its art style, but compared to the first two games I talked about, you might ask why, because it is much more simplistic. I think the reason why is because the art style primarily focuses on the environment rather than the characters. There are a lot of little animations you'll see from things you interact with, as well as background visuals. I also like how, even though there are different themes throughout the game, they still bring back the snow theme often with different variations. Because after all, the story of the game involves climbing a snowy mountain, and I think that's the main reason I wanted to talk about the game. Going into this video, you might have thought that I was going to go super deep into the narrative and try to break down why people like it, and not something related to a mountain.
Surprise, motherfucker!
The thing about the narrative is that even at face value, it matches the gameplay perfectly. Celeste is a 2D platformer that gets harder and harder as you progress through the game. You are climbing up this giant mountain that is broken up into several levels. Pretty ordinary so far. But what I liked is that the character is struggling more and more as she climbs, and it matches perfectly with the levels getting harder and harder as well. So when you finally finish the game, you feel the same sense of accomplishment that the protagonist feels. So even if you ignore the deeper character meanings, which you can discover for yourself, you are still left with a game whose narrative of doing something difficult and accomplishing it is still something that works fundamentally. One other thing I want to mention about Celeste, and it is sort of related, is that I didn't feel the need to try and 100% the game in order to feel like I finished it. I sort of divide platformers into two different categories. There is the category where you feel accomplished by just completing the levels, and the other category is games that feel a bit hollow unless you complete the levels and do all the side stuff like collectibles. Celeste is the former. I didn't feel the need to collect all the strawberries and doing all the B-side sections. I still felt accomplished by going through the levels normally. Not that the latter is bad, it's just that I find the ones that I don't like typically fall into that category. I'm thinking of one right now that I might save for a video on its own. So I think this is going to be a regular thing where I record audio and then once I'm done I think of some other things and have to insert it. So this goes back to what I was talking about with platformers falling into one of two categories, and I just wanted to give an example of both that I think are good. I already gave Celeste as an example of a platformer that gives you a sense of accomplishment without having to do collectibles or side content. Another example is something I have to talk about at some point, and that is the Donkey Kong Country series. Those games have always felt great, and I've never felt the need to collect all the letters and whatnot. But an example of a game that feels great and it makes you feel like you need to collect everything are the 3D Mario games. The last one releasing being Mario Odyssey. I think the reason why I like Mario Odyssey despite being in that category is that the way moons and purple coins are handled. They laid the game out so that you would naturally have the feeling of wanting to collect everything. This was done by making it so that moons were needed to progress at certain points. And purple coins typically weren't as difficult as those moons, so it wasn't a big deal to go out of your way to obtain them as well. So when you reach the very end of the game, a lot of people will have collected everything anyway, so it doesn't feel hollow. Anyway, that's it. Back to the outro. But I think that's everything I wanted to say. The next time I talk about indie games, it will probably be specific indie games like Celeste was. And as for Celeste, it is absolutely worth the purchase. It's one of the best platformers out there, even if you don't care about the art style or narrative elements. So one last thing I want to insert here. Next video might be another week or so. I plan to upload more than I have been, but I want to wait until the rest of the art that is in production for this channel is complete. I wanted to release this video, however, now, just so that there isn't a complete 2 weeks between videos. So this might be the last video with the old transition and end screens. And with that, thank you for watching, like and subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in whatever I decide to talk about next. Peace.